I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture of this year through the Humanities Center, the first Stanford lecture. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm the second director of the Center for the Humanities. Our founder, Miyoko Suzuki, whom I'm sure many of you have seen over the years, has finally and probably unfortunately for all of us passed on the baton, but I'm going to try to do the best I can to step into her shoes. I will take no blame for the fact that you now have to pay for parking, but I will apologize for it. That's a new policy by the university. We fought it and we lost. I don't want to take so long, but I'll just remind you that we have many upcoming events. We have some flyers outside. I will just mention the next Stanford lecture, which is going to be on Thursday, November 15th, and by Christopher DeHamel, an eminent medievalist, who has also written, believe it or not, a best-selling book on medieval manuscripts that has also won widespread acclaim, so I hope you'll think about attending that. At this point, I'll turn the podium over to Danette Francis of the English department here, who will introduce our speaker, Hazel Carby.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out for what I can assure you will be a very, very good talk this evening and a very important inaugural lecture for our academic year. So for my generation of mid-career academics, encountering Hazel Carby's Reconstructing Womanhood, first published in 1987, taught us how to do American studies as a transatlantic practice requiring literacy in American, British, and Caribbean social histories in order to capture the multiple imperial entanglements in the long arc of the histories of empire. That text, which focused on 19th and early 20th century Black women novelists, turned critical attention away from this turn of the 20th century moment as being the age of struggle between race men, the competing visions of how the Black community should engage the broader America via entrepreneurship or the elevation of an intellectual elite waged by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. The book instead resituates the writings of Black women novelists as activist intellectual history that shaped history rather than as simply passive representations of that history. If Reconstructing Womanhood was a foundational text that reframed literary analysis as intellectual and labor histories, you can imagine how elated we, anxious American Studies graduate students at NYU searching for a transnational feminist methodology, were that when Race Men was published in 1998, New York University was one of the first stops on Professor Carby's book tour. This book modeled and solidified for us that in fact the questions we were trying to disentangle around the intersections of race, empire, womanhood, and the uneven spaces of the Black Atlantic not only made sense, but necessitated being asked and urgently answered. While these books have made strong interventions across multiple fields and generations of criticism, Carby's body of work reminds us of how pivotal the essay form has been to Black feminist theory, a fact demonstrated in her essays gathered and published in Cultures of Babylon in 1999. For me, it is Carby's 1992 essay, Policing the Black Woman's Body in the Urban Context, that has always been a touchstone to think carefully and critically about the politics of intraracial, gendered class relations. It has, in many ways, anticipated current debates about respectability versus ratchet, and to our young undergraduates will know what that means. But there's more. Professor Carby's intellectual labor took on public projects that engaged the social history of visual culture and what it says about the very idea and practice of American democracy. In 2004, in the midst of the Iraq War, Dr. Carby mounted A Strange and Bitter Crop, which curated images of torture to make explicit the direct but hidden line connecting Abu Ghraib, the Rodney King video, and the photographs and postcards of lynching that circulated widely in the early 20th century. That show, which opened at the New York Historical Society, traveled throughout the U.S. and intervened into debates about an American military presence in Abu Ghraib and the repeated debasement of the black and brown body as symbolic spectacle, especially in photography. More recently, in the 2014-2015 academic year, Professor Carby co-curated with her graduate student, Heather Vermeulen, Prospects of Empire, Slavery and Ecology in the 18th Century Atlantic Britain at the Lewis Walpole Library in Farmington, Connecticut. This exhibit was a part of a larger Yale initiative exploring the visual representations of transatlantic slavery and notions of empire's prospects as it gazed upon bodies and landscapes, its speculations and desires, its endeavors to capitalize upon seized land and labor, as well as its failure to manage enslaved persons and unruly colonial ecologies. With such projects, Professor Carby has consistently modeled not only what it means to be a careful, engaged scholar and close reader, as well as what it means to work as a part of an intellectual collective. She brings that skill set and commitment to public intellectual work, making a difference in the local, national, and international public spheres in which her work circulates. So the aforementioned body of work culminates in Professor Carby's latest book, Imperial Intimacies, from which she will give tonight's Henry King Stanford Distinguished Lecture. Engaging both academic and popular audiences, Imperial Intimacies will be published as a trade book by Verso Press in October of 2019 and brings together the arc of an intellectual career meaningfully lived on both sides of the Atlantic. Born in post-war Britain, from 1972 to 1979, Professor Carby worked as a high school English teacher and labor organizer in the East End of London. She subsequently earned a PhD from the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK in 1984. Dr. Carby began her academic career at Wesleyan University and joined the Yale faculty in 1989. She is currently the Charles and C. Dorothea S. Gilley Professor of African American Studies and Professor of American Studies, and also the Director of the Initiative of Race, Gender, and Globalization, all at Yale. A foundational scholar of U.S. Black feminist literary and intellectual histories, Professor Carby's body of work provides an opportunity to think about Black intellectual formation, migrations, and interventions on both sides of the Atlantic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carby to the University of Miami community.
Thank you, Donette, for a beautifully sculpted introduction. That was really thoughtful. And thank you to everyone for the very warm welcome I've had here. And I'm delighted to meet you all. I met some of the graduate students this morning, and they were wonderfully warm and enthusiastic and asked me excellent questions. So thank you, everybody. So let me just start this. As dusk fell on June the 21st, 1948, launches packed with sightseers circled a British troop ship in the Thames estuary. Fog was beginning to form in the marshes, but the passengers on board the Empire Windrush eagerly returned the waves of those below. Formerly German and bearing the name the Monte Rosa, the ship had transported German troops into battle, borne prisoners from Norway to concentration camps, and evacuated German refugees fleeing the advance of the Red Army. In 1945, the Monte Rosa was seized as a prize of war by the British, converted once more into a troop ship, and renamed in January 1947. The names of British troop ships began with the word Empire, followed by the name of a river. The River Windrush begins in the Cotswold Hills and meanders through Oxfordshire before its confluence with the Thames, but only those who lived along its banks or in the village named after it think of a river when its name is spoken. Sailing regularly on the Southampton, Gibraltar, Suez, Aden, Colombo, Singapore, Hong Kong route, the Empire Windrush made just one journey to the Caribbean, but it was this journey that inscribed it into British history. If ships are haunted by the voices of the passengers they have carried, it is only certain sounds that are heard when the name the Empire Windrush is evoked. Silent are the anxious whispers of German troops as they crouched upon its decks. Gone are the sighs of relief from rescued evacuees mounting its gangplanks. And eradicated are the cries of despair from the Norwegian Jews who huddled in its hold and would not return to the land of their birth. What does remain is the voice of a Calypsonian, Aldwyn Roberts, better known as Lord Kitchener, whose music carried the hopes, the dreams, and the disappointments of a generation of West Indians who came home to Britain, the mother country. On June the 22nd, Roberts and 491 other passengers from Jamaica, carrying British passports, embarked at Tilbury with the intention of being part of the labour force needed to rebuild the devastated metropolitan heart of empire. Most of the passengers on the Empire Windrush were returning servicemen, many of them former RAF personnel. But their service to Britain during World War II was quickly forgotten, and his or her claims to being as British as anyone else denied. Outside of my immediate family, it seemed as if the ship was remembered only as the first of many ships that carried racial problems into the country. My father, a flight sergeant in the RAF, was sent to Jamaica to escort servicemen returning from leave on one of those ships, and he was one of those problems. Also problems were his 2 children and his wife, who, in addition to being a traitor to her race, must be a slut because no respectable white woman would associate with, let alone marry, a Jamaican. During the first bitter cold months of 1948, a girl was born to Iris and Carl. At the tail end of the post-war baby boom, she was one of 48 children in her elementary school classroom. Anti-immigrant sentiment flourished as she grew from infant to teenager. In this increasingly antagonistic atmosphere, evocations of the Windrush became a burden to bear. It was as if the ship represented a cultural and political break in time. A mythological system of beliefs invented divisions in the before and the after of British history. Before the Windrush, Britain was white. Black bodies contaminated traditional British values. The heartbeat of the nation was regulated by the rhythms of fair play until black people arrived from the colonies and the cancerous traces of race and racism appeared in the nation's bloodstream. Before boatloads of ungrateful immigrants landed and taxed the natural tolerance of its domestic citizens to unacceptable limits, the British Empire had been a benevolent force for good in its colonies. In short, the Windrush symbolised the beginning of the end of empire and Britain's demise from the status of being a great power. At school, the girls suffered the consequences of this historical amnesia. When the boy who sat at the desk to her right, the one who used to pinch her arm whenever the teacher's head was turned towards the blackboard, when he had finished talking about heat and flies and deserts and driving tanks across Egypt, he looked at her smugly as if to say, "Beat that." It was her turn to describe the contribution of her father to the war effort. She stood and stated clearly that her father served in the RAF. On the piano at home stood this photograph. A young man in RAF uniform with an enigmatic smile, head tilted at a slightly rakish and daredevil angle, holding a pipe in his hand. In the eyes of his daughter, her father was the epitome of wartime British heroism. But before the girl could describe the photograph to her classmates, she was abruptly interrupted by the teacher. In a loud, sharp voice, she was told to sit back down and listen carefully. She sat. The entire class was stunned. Silenced by their teacher's angry glare, they stared at the girl, who cowered in shock and humiliation, as the teacher warned her about the dire consequences of telling lies, and insisted that there were no coloured people in Britain during the war, that no coloured people served in any of the armed services, and certainly not in the RAF, the most elite branch of the British military. The eyes of the teacher swept like searchlights over the class, scanning the rows of desks behind which the children sat, rigid. There was nowhere to hide. Speaking in the slow and deliberate tone of voice that she adopted when she would brook no opposition, the teacher declared that coloured people were not British, but came as immigrants who arrived on these shores after the war had been fought and won. All the children shifted back in their seats. This was the girls' formal introduction to British history, as taught in the 1950s at her elementary school. She had previously absorbed the fact that she was a nigger, a wog, coloured and half-caste, and now she learned that she was not considered British. By the time she was old enough to be aware of her surroundings, she lived in Mitcham, then in the county of Surrey, a large part of which lay in the metropolitan green belt. Surrey was famous for its beauty of its North Downs. Surrey had more woods than any other county in the UK, and Surrey was home to the wealthiest population in Britain. Iris, her mother, loved having an address in a posh county, as if the mere reputation of Surrey could burnish all their lives. Her ambition was to move south, deeper into Surrey, to achieve middle-class status and gain the security it promised. But Iris never rubbed shoulders with the residents of the stockbroker belt. Mitcham was part of Surrey in name only, and the neighbourhood was the last gasp of the working class estates of South London, the boundary before gracious living began. It was ugly and soulless, and as with similar other South London estates, it was a nursery for white supremacist hatred. In 1965, Mitcham was finally cast out of Surrey and incorporated into the London Borough of Merton. With the change of address, Iris's hopes of class mobility were dashed. As an adult, I can compile an inventory of the history and design of this environment, but to the girl, it was as if an incomprehensible higher power delivered hunks of concrete and steel, complete, unexpected, and unwelcome. She knew the buildings that materialised around her didn't grow, they weren't organic like trees or animals, but she did not know that the residential suburb of South London in which she lived was the product of a human vision, that it had been planned and developed by people in offices. The four major arteries of the neighbourhood of Pollard's Hill radiated outwards from a concrete roundabout with grass and a signpost in the middle. The girl would throw open her bedroom window, elbows on the windowsill, chin resting on hands. She leant into the long twilight of summer evenings, face lit by the moon as she looked out across a grid of carefully tended squares of grass and narrow beds of flowers, partitioned by rows of wooden fences which culminated in a shed or a garage. Through a gap between the corner of the Baptist church and the end of a row of brick terraced houses, she could glimpse the roundabout and listen to combustion engines lower in tone as car, lorry or motorbike slowed and entered the circle, then rise sharply and suddenly in pitch as the vehicles sped away. Sights, sounds and smells of the night were exalting. Breathing the night deep into lungs, it was possible to believe that the roundabout was organic, pliable, a living creature with tentacles, drawing vehicles in towards its heart. Abruptly changing its mind, the creature loosed its grip and flung them screaming out and away into the distance. At night, people were tucked away indoors, and the landscape became soft-edged, filled with shadowy shapes and noises from its non-human residents. Low guttural warnings as felines stalked each other, squeaks and snuffles from rootling hedgehogs, and the urgent, sweaty, smoky reek and rustling of undergrowth announcing the presence of red fox. The girl longed to bring the magic and the promise of the outside indoors. One evening, she crawled under the shrubbery, trapped a hedgehog in a shoebox, smuggled it into her room and into bed to keep as a friend. The girl was a wanderer. Her parents worked long hours, and the neighbour Iris paid to take care of her children was inattentive. She would check to see if her younger brother was contentedly playing with his toys before she crept through the neighbour's kitchen, scampered down the back garden path, lifted the latch on the tall wooden gate, closed it behind her, and ran. It was simple to create mental maps of her neighbourhood by reciting the names of the streets that took her to a destination and reverse the order on her return. Once outside, she explored at will. Inside the walls of her house, she was a girl who was cowed, a shrunken being who worked to render herself invisible. The streets were important avenues of escape. But if the sights, sounds and smells of the night were magical, daylight revealed the crass and the mundane. She explored streets between rows of modest two-story terraced houses. She scurried quickly across the field of prefabs, two-bedroom, single-story, prefabricated aluminum, asbestos-clad bungalows on slabs of concrete hastily erected as a solution to the post-World War II housing crisis, because the inhabitants registered their dislike of brown children through missiles. Prefabs were meant to be temporary structures, but they remained for 20 years. As the girl stood staring at the estate of 6-story maisonettes, she was disoriented by its scale and uniformity. She despaired when the council built a high-density, low-rise estate of 3-story houses and flats because it blocked her route to the hill she loved to climb and roll down. She traversed an area which stretched from the hill, rising directly behind the roundabout, and fanning out southwest until reaching more than 400 acres of common land. The girl avoided the main roads in favour of walking or biking the network of streets which connected them. She was nearly always headed to the common, where she could breathe and roam, or sit under trees and dream, or dig into the silt of ponds just to see what lived there or what was buried there. Having crossed the length of the common, the girl arrived at the town centre, in which stood the library. The common and the library saved her, but she did not learn how to draw a map of what she could not see for many years. The apple trees she climbed, the fragrant wild marjoram and sweet woodruff that she brushed past in her favourite places to explore, the open green space of the common and the hill, were traces of the farms, fields and woodland that, for the most part, had been paved over. Lying dreaming in the long grass of the hill, listening intently to crickets and creating chains of buttercups, the girl could not imagine the remains of the Celtic fort that lay beneath the soil. In the flora of the landscape was evidence of the physic gardeners of the 18th century, who had cultivated 250 acres of lavender, wormwood, chamomile, aniseed, rhubarb, licorice, peppermint, and other medicinal plants, but she was unable to see it. When her brother was old enough, the girl took him to play in the park at the end of Sherwood Park Avenue, site of the vanished Sherwood Farm, which had been demolished to build homes for heroes from the First World War. An act of bureaucratic wizardry had replaced local history with national mythology in the district. Overlaid onto bricks and mortar was a thin veneer of enchantment, evoking the ancient woodlands and footpaths of legend. 3 centuries after the actual Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire had been enclosed, its commons turned into private estates, and its various forest communities dispossessed and dispersed, someone in the town hall in Mitcham decided that war heroes deserved to walk down roads named after the outlaw Robin Hood, his companions, and their habitat. Once upon a time, after the war to end all wars, a town planner bent over a desk in the offices of the local council, peering down at a design of the future district of Pollard's Hill, racking their brains for names that would enable residents to forget the horrors of war and instead think about a medieval world of courtliness while waiting for the bus that would take them to work. Robin Hood had already been used twice, once for a close and again for a lane. The map was also filling up with references to abbots, manors, and the greenwood. Scanning the diagram, this person came across a small, unnamed cul-de-sac protruding from the side of Holly Way. Perhaps the wizard of street names was musing about medieval architecture, or perhaps they consulted one of their architectural colleagues. Either way, the shape of the cul-de-sac reminded someone of an oriel, a medieval bay window designed to bring sunlight and fresh air into the interior of a building. A projection into light, an outlook, a turn away from the darkness of war and brutality. A name selected in a moment of hope before another war loomed on the horizon. This was the name given to the close where the girl would eventually live. A name bequeathed when there were still open green vistas. By the time her family moved in, the view was grim. Housing estates and prefabs spread to the horizon. But for this girl, the world of Robin Hood was living all around her. And for a while, that was sufficient. She was content to explore until she encountered people in shops, the library, the park, at school, or those who, quite rightly, chased her from their apple trees. People who wanted to know where she was from. Now, this question may appear innocuous, but she came to dread it. Her parents had taught her to hold her head erect, to look directly, without guile, at adults who addressed her, to smile with her eyes, not just her teeth, to speak clearly, to be conspicuously open, transparent, and honest. Her dad told her that if she did not follow this advice, she would be regarded as shifty, duplicitous, and unworthy of attention. This girl absorbed every word because she was eager to be considered a good girl, polite and deferential. It was not until she was a teenager that she realized her father had been coaching her on the art of being a good black girl, acceptable to white people. The girl was disconcerted and surprised by increasingly insistent demands to respond to what she came to think of as the question. Her father had not prepared her for such intense cross-examination. At first, she was confused about what was being asked of her because she lived in the same neighbourhood as her interrogators. The girl took pride in her navigational skills, which she honed by following the pathways of the medieval land of Robin Hood, which also happened to be her favourite illustrated storybook at the time. She could provide anyone who asked directions to her house via Abbots, Sherwood and Greenwood roads. But that was not what people wanted from her. The challenge was finding a satisfactory response to what she came to fear as the question. For this girl was deceived by the apparent simplicity of the answer. If a child at school wanted to know where she was from, in a gesture of friendship, she embellished the bare bones of street names with tantalising scraps of tales from the adventures of Robin Hood, Maid Marian and Friar Tuck, outlaws who robbed from the rich to give to the poor. When it became clear that the question demanded a more detailed response than her current address, the girl offered the name of the village in Devon, Folly Gate, where she was born, and stories of Exmoor extracted from the novel Lorna Doone. This information confirmed the fears and anxiety that prompted the question in the first place. The fact that she was born in England rendered her paradoxical. Adults and children alike considered the possibility of her Englishness derisory and dismissed her accounts as deliberately perverse and misleading. Classmates reproduced verbatim the words of their parents. Anyone can see that she's the wrong colour to be around from here. I mean, no matter what she says. The girl was declared a fool and a liar. The suggestion that she was native, that she belonged, was an audacious claim in post-World War II Britain. As I wrote this girl into being, I saw that her dread of the question haunts the woman the girl became. The question is still posed when I'm regarded as being out of place, seen as an enigma, an incongruity, and a curiosity. The girl was confronted by a bewildering array of contesting national and racialized definitions of self and subject. She was being asked to provide a reason for her being which she did not have. It was sobering to realize that where and from did not actually reference geography, but the fiction of race in British national heritage. The girl was cautious as she sought to find her way through this cultural maze, but eventually, when all the answers she could invent were rejected, she reluctantly acknowledged that she was being rebuffed for what she was. When she was dismissed, disregarded and disparaged, when she was treated as less than the human she knew herself to be, her chin sunk to her chest, she mumbled, and she looked sideways out of the corner of her eyes. She became the uncooperative black girl her father did not want her to be. Classmates grew bored with her petulant refusal to reveal a difference, their pinches and punches tried to expose. The girl's body reddened and bruised under fingers poking and squeezing as if unravelling a dense series of knots. Knuckles vented their frustration on her brown skin. I can still see this girl refusing to let anyone see her cry. All tears were suppressed until back at her desk she concealed her face with a book and then let them trickle in silence down her cheeks. And in this way, books became her refuge. Far more fearsome than leaving classmates dissatisfied was irritating a teacher or any curious adult who asked the question. They interpreted silence and shrugs as deliberate perversity, an outright refusal to cooperate. This girl discovered that the adoption of a posture of timidity with just a hint of speech impairment was likely to end the interrogation. Answers were mumbled incoherently, with eyes lowered to feet neatly encased in white cotton socks and brown leather Clark's T-bar sandals. Honesty was best avoided in these circumstances. Muttering about being born in England condemned her to their utter disapproval, and the exasperated demand, "But where did you come from before that?" Some adults were convinced that she was not telling the truth. Others believed the girl, an outcome which was actually far, far worse, because then she was accused of being a monstrosity, a half-caste, the issue of a black father and a white mother. Facts failed her, so she turned to fiction. In this unstable landscape, Robin Hood's adventures were much too earthbound for her. When the girl was too young to imagine, let alone assert, that she was not accountable to anyone, she invented alternative figures of authority to whom she would account for herself. She concocted a place on Earth with the help of DC Comics, where she found a short story about a scientist in a laboratory examining drops of water through his microscope. In one drop, he discovered a universe, and by gradually increasing the magnification, located the Milky Way and eventually planet Earth. The girl's fantasy involved travelling from another, kinder galaxy to South London in order to observe the human species in its natural habitat. The mode of travel by which she was transported constantly changed in her head, but the girl did see herself as a scientist who, at an unspecified time and place in the future, would be called upon to report the observations which she carefully kept in her journals. The plot was a bit short on detail, and she had no idea on whose behalf she watched, listened, and wrote, but the girl knew that she must not share the nature of her mission with anyone in her family or at school. Standing on her bed, leaning out of her window, she wondered if the creature inhabiting the roundabout was also an alien. The tall signpost at its centre a transmission for communication with the mothership. But was it a friend or a foe? Could it read her mind? The girl grew adept living in anticipation of the question, which crouched in the shadows, waiting to challenge her right to belong. If only those around her knew where she was really from. Resurrecting the world of this girl is risky for my sense of self, a self which has been carefully assembled out of a refusal to acknowledge or remember. I do not wish to provide justifications for my present or my past self-creations. Demanding that the girl account for her racial self was contemptible. She stumbled for many years before she learnt the difficult lesson that she was not accountable to those who questioned her right to belong. The question destabilizes my world still, because there is no answer that can satisfy racist conjectures about the shades of brown in skin. My father, of course, was always asked the question too. It was a constant hum in the background of our lives, white noise, a condition of our existence in England. We only spoke of it once. In 1962, my father and his younger brother, who also lived in the UK, had two very different reactions to Jamaican independence. My uncle immediately applied for a Jamaican passport and urged my father to do so. They had a serious disagreement about nationality and allegiance. My father was determined to retain his British nationality, reasoning that he was born a British citizen in a British territory and had lived in the UK for 2 decades before Jamaica became independent. He was actually very proud of being British, and he had no plans to live anywhere else. Now, 16 years later, my father wished to travel to the United States to visit his younger siblings and their families. Like most people, he had not constantly renewed his British passport because he hadn't travelled outside of the country since being demobilised from the RAF in 1950. Being a very methodical man, he assembled the paperwork necessary for his application for a new passport. He wrote to the Ministry of Defence requesting documentation of his service in the Royal Air Force, and when it arrived, he placed it in a file with his original British passport, which had expired on April the 8th, 1948. The application process required an interview at Luna House, the headquarters of the Immigration and Nationality Directorate in Croydon. It was on this occasion that my father confronted the question in its most aggressive and antagonistic form, a situation where disbelief had nasty consequences. I regret not being a witness to what occurred in that immigration room. I know if I had been there, I would have lost my temper, and my father would have been ashamed of such behaviour in his daughter. He would have deemed it undignified. When my father described how he had been treated in the interview, I shared in his humiliation. As I sat by his side, he held fast to my hand, his grasp as tight as that of a man who was drowning. He seemed to be forcing air into his lungs through a throat constricted with the effort not to cry, not to scream with frustration. His need to tell his story fought against his distress. He could barely speak. And I felt as if I was manipulating mental forceps to extract word by word what happened. My father, then 57, was interviewed by a young woman who not only insulted and intimidated him, but accused him of lying, of being an illegal immigrant, one of those who had, quote, sneaked into the country, landing at night on the Essex coast with a boatload of other illegals, end of quote. This representative of the British Immigration Service declared that all his records, including his RAF record and original passport, were probably forgeries. This was an absurd accusation. I knew that in the face of this racist rant, my father would have maintained his dignity, making no demands to see a superior official, not complaining or raising his voice. He just bent to pick up his papers, which the interviewer had swept off her desk onto the floor in a wild gesture of incredulity. Once gathered, he did not look at her again, but stood with his head held high, turned his back on her, walked out of her office, and left the building. Evidently, the interview was just an exercise in humiliation. For my father was not issued any official documentation of application denial, nor were any procedures instigated against him as an illegal immigrant. When he walked out of the room, I imagine that the interviewer felt smug and self-satisfied, believing he wouldn't be back, as she'd given another one of them a hard time. The aim of this performance was to dissuade my father from pursuing his claim to Britishness any further, because she had shown him that he was not welcome. Such are the pleasures reaped by Home Office bureaucrats in the course of their day. Respectability, honesty, loyalty and duty were ingrained in my father, and he regarded himself as a British gentleman in every aspect of his being. He carried all his records to the Jamaican High Commission on the 5th of May, where, in order to be issued with a Jamaican passport, he had to formally renounce his British citizenship, an act which was deeply painful for him. I have kept all my father's papers. Gathered from the floor of the office in Croydon is his first British passport, issued on April the 8th, 1943, which declares the national status of Carl Colin Carby to be a British subject by birth and his profession Royal Air Force recruit, alongside the letter of confirmation of service from the Ministry of Defence. I have his 3 Jamaican passports, all of which carry entry visas to the USA, his birth certificate, and handwritten copies of every letter that my father wrote to the Immigration and Nationality Directorate over a period of more than 2 decades. Each letter is formally addressed, "Dear Sirs, Madam." Each letter is stapled and labelled "Copy." Taken together, these papers form an archive of the shifting racist terrain of the rules and regulations of British immigration. One of the letters, dated February the 10th, 2003, addresses the recent restrictions on Jamaicans travelling to England. In it, my father asks if these restrictions will affect his return to the UK after attending the graduation of his grandson, my son, from high school in the USA. Most poignant is a letter written later that same year, which declares, "I am now 82 years of age and wish to complete my affairs by reverting to a British subject." He details every aspect of his life in the RAF, explains that he's the recipient of an award for long service from the Westminster City Council, and an owner of properties in Streatham and Mitcham in London, and at the time of writing in the city of York. This letter, accompanied by extensive documentation, concludes, "I shall be most grateful for your kind consideration." The process took 18 months. On July the 19th, 2004, issued on the direction of the Secretary of State, Home Office, London, my father was granted a certificate of naturalisation as a British citizen under the British Nationality Act of 1981. As an adult living in the USA, I find that unexpressed assumptions determine the terms, conditions and boundaries within which any answer provided to the question, "Where are you from?" will be accepted or dismissed. When I wish to be agreeable, I expend effort analysing which conjectures are in play, and I attempt to provide an answer which satisfies expectations and avoids a miserable sense of failure. Failure to be unsatisfyingly read places the person who asked in the awkward position of having to repeat the question, which is then very patiently and painstakingly re-articulated with a change of emphasis in a louder and more forceful tone of voice, as if I was hard of hearing. Where are you from? Meaning, of course, are you black or white? Like a cat with its paw on the tail of a hapless mouse, I glean pleasure from watching an interrogator flounder. However, I have to exercise caution in my selection of prey. It is unseemly to torment one's professional colleagues. It is dangerous to play mind games with British immigration personnel or police in the UK. And it is asking for serious trouble to joke with officials from Homeland Security or cops in the US of A. As a result of this lifetime of negotiation, of observation and reporting, I am armed with a series of suitable explanations for my various selves. I have fictional and factual justifications for the where, when, and why of their being, and I carry a potted history for all occasions, like when a distinguished black professor asked, "How did a nice white girl like you come to study African American literature?" As a woman, as a writer and an academic, I am assumed to be out of place. Too black to be British, too white or too West Indian to be a professor of African American studies. The question, of course, is the wrong question. If I am asked to identify the origin of the multiple selves I have become, without hesitation I describe the various libraries in which the girl I no longer recognize, the girl I have long since left behind, the girl I discarded and rejected, found sanctuary. Thank you. So I also should explain those slides you saw of the demonstrations outside of Luna House were actually taken last year, 2017 protests. The first was the March of the Southeast Fascists, my words, the Southeast Alliance, the Anti-Immigrant Alliance, and the others were the Antifa protesters. So I thought I'd use that to say, still fighting out there.
Well, thank you, and there's time for questions. We have people with microphones, and so just raise your hand and we'll bring you mic.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I guess I'll ask the obvious question since I'm the only willing party anyway. Talk to us about what the process of writing a memoir is like as a scholar. What was it like? What did you learn about the process of history, creating history, by looking into your own records and your own life?
Okay, so the first response is it's very deliberately not a memoir. The book actually begins with a quote from Gramsci, which is about the necessity of understanding our invention as historical subjects. So it's actually historical recreation, it's not a personal story in that sense. And there's multiple reasons for that. The genre of memoir is sort of dominated by, and this is sort of like historical, by people who have not actually had to think critically about their own racialization. You know, you can't think about Black lives in the sort of Benjamin Franklin format, right? You have to explain an awful lot that dominant forms of memoir don't have to do. So it takes the memoir form as a problem. not as a solution. So the book actually travels backwards from the 1950s to the 1750s to Jamaica and the plantation owner who actually owned the Carbys in Jamaica. And so what it does at each point, it uses people in my family as coat hangers on which to investigate the depth of history, the way in which they formed themselves both in relation to the notion of whiteness and became racialized beings who thought they were superior to people in the colonies. Alongside their questions of gendering, I follow the women in my on my maternal side, for example, in various cities. So the cities, Bristol, Bath, Cardiff, are approached historically, and I ask questions about, what were the processes both of racialization and of affiliating even the poorest people, because they were incredibly poor, to imagining themselves as superior to these other buildings, these other people, that they actually owned colonies and the people in it. And so it's about examining this wider history of the intimate, what I think of as the intimate relations between Britain and Jamaica, coming in and out of hanging it on different moments in the lives of people in my family. It is actually above all an archival project. This section that I read you tonight, where are you from, is basically, the whole book is like a response to that question, where are you from? It's multiple, it's incredibly complex. And if you actually think, the 18th century is very important to me in many ways, and it's also that formative moment where it is imagined, British historians argue that a notion of Britishness congeals, but those historians don't place Equiano at the centre of it. And his narrative is a multiple Britishness. He insists on being British and African and Christian and from the Caribbean, and he has a worldly sense which is not the sort of narrow parochial sense of Britishness. So it's that multiplicity, actually a multiplicity of voices and of selves, that I try to maintain throughout the book. And at times it's also a work of creative non-fiction, because family memories take you so far. My father's memories of being taken by his grandmother from Kingston back to Swift River in Portland, Jamaica, on the other side of the island, actually guided me through the archives to actually find the records, the slave registers of the plantation, and to identify for the first time this name of this person who was a slave owner. I mean, it meant that I had to track them, but so on the one hand, family memories could be used to sort of supplement or navigate the archives. On the other hand, family memories can be a real impediment. Families lie, and they pass down lies throughout the generations. There are things they don't want to talk about, and things I was finding I had to think about for the first time. So I try to make those different investments that people had in being historically constituted subjects very, very visible. And I also leave unresolved moments when I was making assumptions about something, and then later on in the archives I actually found I was completely wrong. Those things are just left there, unresolved. I don't try to make this a sort of seamless. So it's really about exploring the possibilities of form, which actually can account for a black life, which doesn't have to be accountable to this, notion of a white interrogator or whatever, or even to a conventional sense of what, how you construct life writing it's a very different form. So one of the decisions I had to make about what publisher I was going to go with was if they read it and they said, oh yes, well, because they love it. Oh, we can market this as a memoir. I said, thank you, no, I'm not going with you. So it's, it's being marketed, it's going to be a trade book, but it's being marketed very differently, not an anti-memoir. There's somebody at the back.
I enjoyed your talk very much, and I look forward to reading your book when it comes out. But it seems to me that you're using the form of personal narrative, writing out through the history of your family to anchor the stories and the analysis you're making, and that empowers you, but it also is a risk because of exactly the intersectionality of black, white, scholar, trade, memoir. Is it going to be the second form memoir? How you're using the subjectivity and family history strikes me as very interesting and very powerful, but also pretty risky in an academic context.
Mm-hmm. That's why it's mainly an archival project, actually. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be misread. I mean, I can't do much about that. I actually confront that sort of head on in the preface by talking about Kincaid and her notion of an ideal, reader, though her ideal reader was dead, and it's very interesting why that. So I actually talk about her book, My Brother, and, put that problem right up there, centre and front.
Thank you for coming to UM, by the way. So, I wanted to ask if this sort of creation of the historical self, with the Gramercy quote you talked about earlier at the beginning of the book, I was wondering how that, for you in your classroom, kind of operates and how you see maybe this book interjecting into scholarship as well. More so about like how the creation of the self can inform your classroom as a professor, the creation of the historical self as a type of interjection into scholarship.
Because in many ways, I actually see the book coming out of all the years that I've been teaching, and teaching about questions of, thinking about questions of what is called identity, but not using them, really trying to take apart and to think historically about what that formation is, and how even notions of race are very historically specific at different moments in time. They're not all the same, and they're not the same from place to place. So in many ways, in fact, in a way, my son said it best when he was starting to read what I was writing. When he got to that place about, being a child who was, and I kept a journal of my observations. He sort of said, you've actually done that throughout your life. This is in a way exactly a result of that. So I actually see it, and I'm very serious about thinking about everything I've learned from being, a feminist theorist, from everything I've learned and practiced from being. From thinking very critically about formations of race and gender and sexuality and their relation to each other, and that I've taken all that and I'm now trying to practice it in a different way and in a different voice. So in a way, I'm sort of like reversing what you said, and it's from years of engaging with all my graduate students and undergraduates too. In terms of intervention, on the US side, it's clearly intervening in this notion of, in notions that people have of what they think of as sort of British history and what they want to be a narrative of interracial romance, because of all the experiences of, in the US, of the history of racialized. They set up certain expectations. They think I'm going to be writing a Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, narrative. And it's absolutely the opposite of that. So there's like that side of it. But more important to me is the intervention it's making in the field of British historiography. Much more important. There's been so many narratives, the end of the last century into this one, which have basically being apologising, being apologists for colonialism, saying we really need to reassess all that's too much negativity. It was actually a very good thing, and all this. There's tons of that which actually dominates what I think of as the sort of, the Royal Historical Society version of history. And they actually asked me to address them once. They were totally outraged. But it was, in fact, I gave the Abu Ghraib talk to them, pulling in the role that the British had in torture too. And there were older generations of historians who were just basically spitting. They were going red and purple in the face, and were just saying, heard enough about this stuff about race, and they've just handed it up. I mean, it was like appalling, really. Although more appalling was seeing the younger historians not wanting to rock the boat because their careers were dependent on these people, and they didn't. Even though I actually found out afterwards it was the younger ones who invited me, they didn't want to. They were coming up to me in sort of corners of the shops on campus after the lecture and whispering in the aisles, about it was actually really good, but like not, wanting their mentors to. Anyway, whatever. But there's a lot of that, and it's also the history of relations in terms of the sort of slave trade, especially after the whole glorification and celebration of the fact that the British abolished the slave trade, not that they were actually, for nearly 4 centuries, the biggest traders in enslaved human beings. So there's still a lot of sort of denial going on, and as you can see, enough of multiculturalism already. We've had it. There's a limit. All that. And then there's the way in which the history of Jamaica and the UK has been written about as if the profits from the actual plantations themselves were really only benefiting the super rich. This is a history that really just deals with, aristocrats and big houses, and there's actually a lot of sort of very well-intentioned work, finding sort of paintings in country houses that have, black pages in them, and trying to sort of, unravel that history. But the history I want to tell, and the history I have told, is of someone who came from a poor background and got swept up in the revolutionary and Napoleonic wars and deposited in Jamaica. There were lots of troops sent to Jamaica, and then became a small planter, a coffee planter, not a sugar planter, and the way in which, his family, ordinary people, his father was a carpenter, the way in which, in Bristol it wasn't just the ship owners who profited from the slave trade, it was the barrel makers and the leather makers and the rope makers, and, that it actually permeated down to everyday society, including different people in my family who also imagined themselves. I actually tried to structure how they became empire's subjects, and I do that on both sides, in Jamaica and the UK. So I hope it's actually very theoretically informed and sophisticated in terms of the way it's working through and the questions it's tackling. I'm just trying to do it in a more accessible voice, and keep all my integrity intact.
I want to thank you for this talk. It was just really wonderful, and I have to link back tears and all that. One thing that was really striking was your mention of journaling as a child in response to the DC Comics, and one thing that I've been...
Thank heavens for DC Comics.
It was really
and fantasy.
Just fantastic, and part of the reason why I'm so struck by it is because I've been thinking about this quote that there are Black people in the future. And it feels to me, and Alicia Wormsley, who's an artist here in the US, in Philadelphia, I believe, has done an interesting exhibit with this. And so when you mentioned the idea about form and how this narrative needed to be in a form that you could control, that you could best express the stories you wanted to tell, I thought about the DC reference, the DC Comics reference, and I thought about the idea that as we write Black people into the future and insist on it, that the form has to change. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit about a little more maybe about that idea of imaginative form in terms of helping us to identify and sort of create ourselves as subjects that can be explored in different ways, and even as a kind of playful thing, because there's a great connection between comics and play. And
Oh, absolutely.
so I wondered if you...
Yeah, I mean, I should say I teach Afrofuturism. I mean, I've been, well, you can see, I've been a fan of science fiction since I could read. But I think there is actually a lot of stake. I'm a firm believer in Stuart Hall's phrase: "Identity is not in the past; it's in the future to be made." And that is absolutely key to me. And that's why there's this sense that to whom are you accountable? And I think there's actually a lot of really interesting anti-colonial and alternative accounting of being in all its forms in a lot of really interesting Afrofuturist, writers. I mean, I'm a great fan of N.K. Jemisin, for example. But I mean, I could just, go on and on. I teach a lot of that stuff, and I also teach a lot of art and artworks along with the question of the literary, and try to get the students to understand how to be able to think across the question of what may be a literary voice and a visual voice, and how those, really engage each other sort of very, very deeply. And the question always is a sort of futuristic question, because it's like, what's at stake? Do you see what I mean? What is at stake for building? So, yes, it's not about being accountable to this past. It's actually, dismantling how we may be locked in those, to think incredibly broadly about future possibilities in all their ramifications. And that does, that then absolutely includes the question of, in terms of literature, narrative form. And that's why I think that the sort of sense of that creative non-fiction world gives you an awful lot of possibility. And there's a lot of really interesting, examples of how that is working now, whether it's, Amitav Ghosh and his, the trilogy that begins with Sea of Poppies, where you actually he takes the ships that used to transport the enslaved across the Atlantic, and how they're then used to take indentured labor, across the Pacific, and he creates the sort of international languages that happened aboard this ship. And they're extraordinary to read. I mean, there's people who are making their future in front of them. And one sort of critic said, the real problem with, Sea of Poppies and this whole trilogy, you can't understand really what they're saying. I mean, this is languages being invented in front of your eyes. And you see, well, yes, that's exactly the point. It was always about the future. It was always about the future, for captives, for being indentured or whatever. It was always about the future. And so if we can anchor ourselves in those conversations, then thinking about the sort of multiplicity of voice is absolutely, key. And that's what N.K. Jemisin does, at the very beginning of Fifth Season. And the fact that you're just not sure where you are is exactly the point. Because readers are too anchored in forms where they expect and make assumptions about where they are and about what is a given. And we have to say, no, no, you have to remove that given. That is no, you have to actually figure out that you are somewhere else. And if you're going to refuse it, then you're going to refuse it. But if you go with it, it's incredibly richly rewarding. questions?
I think we have time for one more question.
So I'm going to take that to mean one more question from one more person. I'm going to ask 2 questions. But I see them as connected. The first question is, I'm imagining you've spent the last 6, 8 years working on this book project? 10.
Teaching full-time and stuff like that, except for the past year. Yeah.
So, what does it mean for you to be writing this book in this historical moment in the United States? Because I'm struck by the fact that yours is a book that goes back to the Caribbean and back to and in this moment, there's this peculiar narrative both in the UK and in the US of sort of trying to, I can't even say reimagine because it's not that imaginative, right? In the sense of sort of stripping away the destruction of Windrush documents, the practice now of declaring citizens in the US non-citizens because they can't produce certain documents, right? And
Right,
so,
this is, the whole...
So as I was listening to you, I was thinking, wow.
Unfortunately, battles that you have fought throughout your life, you're finding you're having to fight again, and a whole other generation out on the street fighting battles you thought you had actually won, and then you see any of those gains being, sort of removed. There's particularities, I actually believe it's real payback for 8 years of a black president on the one hand, but it's also payback for the fact that residents of the US are actually extremely reluctant to acknowledge that they have a long history of fascism in this country. They think fascism happened in Europe, and so they've been in denial about that for much too long. Well, those of us who are in African American studies know all that. We've been saying that, for a long time. And don't get me started on Brexit. I mean, I'm sorry. Or Fortress Europe, or the thousands of people who were dying in the Mediterranean. I mean, the rise of the extreme right in Europe too is also in response to Fortress Europe. If you're looking to politicians, there isn't an ethic or a moral bone in any of their bodies, basically, at this point in time. And the real problem is, especially, this is such an archival project. I've been in the archives in Jamaica and in the UK or whatever, and it's just, there's no, don't get me wrong, there's no redemption, there's no liberation in colonial archives. But you do find, unfortunately, things that were happening maybe in the 18th century that are happening again. Very parochial notions of what Britishness is, narrow redefinitions. Actually, even further back, because, and I actually touch on this in part of the book as I travel back. There's this whole attempt, and it's been going on for more than a decade. What's really important is to recover our Anglo-Saxon origins. You know what I mean? The denial that Britain itself was such a polyglot community made up out of, invasion after invasion. It's just like, no, we need to find out we're all real Anglo. And it's at every level. It's not just archival, it's the way it's, informing PBS programs. So it's happening on every front.
Have you felt the need, if the book is coming out next year, I'm envisioning you're sort of nearing the conclusion. Have you felt the need?
Oh no, I'm doing the last editing. I handed in the manuscript in the spring, and now they've asked for edits. Yeah.
You haven't read them to give you back the conclusion so as to address some of our contemporary moments in relation to...
all the contemporary moment was in there. They've taken it out.
Okay.
Yeah, they sort of think it's obvious that it's like flogging a dead horse, because I really did get incredibly preachy. But the thing is, I'm going to publish that stuff anyway, but as essays.
Can I ask everybody to join me and thank you?